G'day guys and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video we're going to be talking in detail about the rear suspension setup I have on my Toyota Landcruiser 200 series. So I get asked a lot of questions about the suspension setup, but in particular a lot about the rear suspension and how I find the 400 kilo constant rear springs. So I'm going to go over detail in about why I fitted them, how I've gone about doing it, and would I do it again. And also a bit of detail about the airbag suspension setup and the aftermarket Panhard rod and why I fitted that as well. So let's go into detail about it all and whether or not I would do it the same way again if I had the chance. Okay guys, so I've broken the rear suspension setup in my Cruiser down to three sort of sections or components that I've used to make up the full system. So the first one is the springs and shocks, the second one is the Airbag Man air helper kit, and the third one being the aftermarket Panhard rod. So we'll go through each component in detail, why I fitted them, how I've gone about doing it, and whether I would change anything. Okay guys, so like I said, there are three main components. The first one being the springs and shocks I fitted to this vehicle. So I've gone for a ARB OME BP-51 suspension system, and this all came in a kit together to allow me to upgrade the GVM. So in this particular vehicle, I'm running the 400 kilo constant rear coil springs at the back. And this allows me to get my stock GVM from 3,350 kilos all the way up to 3,845 kilos. So the 400 kilo constant rear spring means that this spring is suited to carry the weight of the vehicle plus 400 kilos of gear at any one time. Now when I originally fitted this spring, I was a little bit hesitant. I actually wanted to go for the 250 kilo constant spring, as I really didn't think I'd be carrying 400 kilos around constantly on a day-to-day basis. Fitting the 250 kilo constant spring would have only taken my GVM to around the 3.5 ton mark rather than the 3.845 ton mark that we've currently got. So when I first brought the car in and got recommended the 400, I was a little bit hesitant. When I picked the vehicle up, I was fully expecting the vehicle to be extremely firm and rough in the rear end, in particular because the vehicle was fairly stock standard when I had the suspension system fitted. However, when I did pick the Cruiser up, I was surprised somewhat. Yes, of course it was firmer and stiffer, however it was nowhere near as bad as I first thought it would be. Now one thing I did observe with this particular kit is ARB advertised their kit as a 2-inch front lift and a 1-inch lift in the back. Now this wasn't my experience. I ended up getting a 4-inch lift in the back and a 3-inch lift in the front. Now from factory, Toyota Landcruiser 200 series do come out with a front rake, which means that the front of the car is angling down a little bit. Now this is by design, and obviously ARB's kit is there to negate that rake a little bit and try and flatten out the stance of the vehicle. Now having 4 inches in the front and 3 in the back obviously exaggerated the rake and made it look quite nose heavy. Now I'm not sure whether it was just my particular vehicle, whether the stock suspension had sagged and therefore it was obviously lifted up a fair bit more. However, the car had only done about 50,000 kilometers when I changed that suspension, so it wasn't like the suspension should have sagged that much. Now this wasn't really an issue, it's just something that I observed that I found interesting, as it wasn't something that ARB informed me of when I fitted the kit. Now since having the kit fitted, I've had almost all of my accessories completed on the vehicle. Now this has obviously settled the suspension, and I found that there still is a fair bit of lift in the back, and it's still about 3 centimeters higher in the back than it is in the front. Again, not that it's a massive issue, it's just an observation I've picked up. Now some of the accessories I've fitted in particular to the back of the vehicle include the drawers in there, obviously the weight of the roof rack, the bigger wheels and tyres, mainly in relation to the spare at the back that's hanging down at the rear, and obviously some electrical equipment as well, including like the compressor that's mounted in the rear quarter panel. Now although this doesn't sound like a whole lot, it doesn't sound like it adds up to 400 kilos, if you check out my other video in relation to how heavy this Cruiser actually is, completely empty, you'd be surprised about how much it does actually weigh. Having the 400 kilo constant springs in there have been perfect in my application. Given that I'm someone who loads this vehicle up when we go away caravanning and camping, and obviously having a caravan or some sort of trailer does put that downboard weight on the back, these 400 kilo constant springs have been perfect for my application and have been really well suited even to that unladen day-to-day driving. If you are someone like me who does do a bit of four-wheel driving and touring, loads their vehicle up for the weekends or does tow a van, I would not recommend a spring rate any less than 400 kilos. Otherwise you would just be looking at that reduced GVM, potentially going over even that modified 3.5 ton GVM that you get with the 250 kilo constants, and probably a little bit of sag in the rear as well. Now, if you're going to fully modify your vehicle with a rear bar, long range tanks and even more accessories, then maybe even start to look at the 600 kilo constant rear springs. Now with this kit from ARB, I did opt to go for the BP-51 remote reservoir fully adjustable shock absorbers. Now this has played a big part in the suspension system as well, and something that I have been very happy with so far. I've had no issues with the suspension system themselves, including some of the known faults of the bushes making some squeaking sounds and wearing prematurely, and also the protective guards on the bottom of the shock breaking away, neither of which I've had a problem with throughout the year of owning them and taking this on some four-wheel drive tracks. Now, being fully adjustable on the compression and the rebound, this shock has made this car very, very comfortable to drive. Given that it is significantly heavier than a stock 200 series, being able to adjust and stiffen the rebound and compression when you need to really does give the vehicle that extra bit of ride comfort, both when fully loaded and day-to-day unladen driving. Now, I have become aware that since ARB have done my car, they have released a new kit which does take that GVM to I think over 4 ton, which is obviously going to be an advantage if you don't tow. You do carry very, very heavy loads in your vehicle. The reason I say it's going to be an advantage when you don't tow is that keep in mind, if you do load your vehicle up to 4 ton, it is going to eat away at that GCM, meaning that you're no way going to be able to tow 3.5 ton behind your vehicle if you are heavily loaded. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about the shock absorber themselves because I am going to dedicate a separate video for that. However, the BP-51 shock is a 51mm bore shock with bypass valves in an internal sleeve that gives the shock absorber progressive dampening on both extremes of the compression and rebound. So this does come in very, very handy when tailor setting your car to your style of driving. So in addition to fitting those 400 kilo constant rear springs to the back of the Landcruiser, I also opted for an airbag helper kit as well from a company called the Airbag Man. So what this is essentially like a balloon type device which is inserted into the center of the coils in the rear suspension, and it gives the ability to increase and decrease pressure within those bags to essentially increase and decrease the spring rate of that coil suspension. Now, it's not a standalone product and you do have to have the coils as well in addition to those bags, but what it does is it gives you that adjustability when you're out on the road to increase or decrease the spring rate of the rear suspension depending on your driving style and what you're carrying at the time. So the reason that we fit a kit like this to our vehicle is for ride comfort in both unladen and fully laden conditions. So at the moment the cruiser is fairly empty and I'm only running between 5 and 8 psi just to maintain the shape and integrity of those bags. Now when we load up to go camping, whether we load up the back of the car or whether we add a trailer or a caravan to the back of the cruiser, increasing that downboard weight on the tow ball, we can increase the airbags to not only bring back a little bit of that height from the sag in the rear suspension, but also increase the spring rate. Now for me personally, this is the second vehicle I've had these airbags fitted to, and they've worked really, really well in both applications. I've always been a little bit skeptical prior to fitting them in regards to damage, punctures and all those types of things. However, in all the driving that I've done and full driving in both the Prado 150 series we used to own and now the 200 series cruiser, I've never had a punctured airbag, had any leaks from any of the airlines or any other issues associated with those airbags. Having the ability to increase the spring rate or the feel in the rear of the vehicle provides dependable, accurate and predictable handling when you've got a heavy vehicle. So not only does it increase the back of the vehicle's height when the suspension is sagged, but having the ability to control your vehicle in an unpredictable incident, like a swerving motion or whether or not you're braking heavily, having an increased spring rate to match the increased load is going to provide that predictable handling and give you the best possible chance of controlling the vehicle in an accident type scenario or an unforeseen incident. So in addition to providing that predictable handling, it also gives us the ability to reduce some of the sag that sometimes comes with loading up these vehicles. Now in particular, this comes in very, very handy when you're towing something like a caravan or a dual axle trailer, because if you do have that sag and it creates that V shape where the drawbar comes down to the depressed rear suspension, you can sometimes encourage a trailer sway through the front axle steer on the van. Being able to increase the pressures in the airbags, lift the back of the vehicle up and lift out your setup will provide more predictable handling and safer control of that trailer. Now keep in mind the rear suspension of the vehicle is only one component in relation to trailer safety and reducing that risk of sway control. However, having correctly loaded vehicles and trailers is also a big part. You need to make sure it's done correctly. So in my experience, this is my 4th modified vehicle, and what I have come across is the fact that it's very, very difficult to estimate the weight of the vehicle when fitting all the aftermarket accessories and the sort of different camping gear and equipment you might be towing or carrying. I've also found that over time, even in the space of a couple of years, your towing and camping gear setups do change frequently, and this will significantly alter the amount of weight in the back of the vehicle. Having airbags gives you that adjustability of the rear springs to suit a wide variety of different setups, meaning that your vehicle is ready to go if you do change your mind and say go from a camping setup with the vehicle to towing a caravan behind the vehicle. Now, while staying in the subject of towing, airbags are incredibly handy for setting up the vehicle correctly, providing that predictable handling. However, they are not a replacement for something like a weight distribution hitch, or WDH. A weight distribution hitch is a significantly different type of setup in relation to your van or your towing trailer and your vehicle. They do very much alter the way in which the weight is distributed, particularly in the vehicle over the front axles, and airbags just can't replicate that. So don't get them confused, they're not a replacement product, it's just a different type of product. Now for me personally, weight distribution hitches just simply aren't an option for my type of setup. They don't allow a huge amount of off-road flexibility and also do reduce the amount of articulation in that hitch. Given the fact that I do frequently go off-road and tow off-road, weight distributions just simply aren't an option for me, and the airbags are the next best thing. If you are someone who tows heavy loads just on the blacktop or on very mild gravel roads where you're not looking at articulating the hitch too much, then have a look at weight distribution hitches for your setup. The third aftermarket component I've had fitted to the Landcruiser is an adjustable rear Panhard Rod. Now, this is not going to be suitable for all applications and everybody who does put a lift kit in their vehicle. However, if you do plan on fitting larger wheels and tyres to your cruiser, it's something that could definitely help both legality and for aesthetics as well. When lifting the back of a solid axle vehicle, which is this 200 series Landcruiser here, it does alter the geometry and the factory adjustment of the placement of that rear axle. Now, when I refer to a solid axle, this is where your wheels are connected through laterally through a single beam or shaft. So your axle literally goes between the two wheels. An independent suspension is like what's on the front of this cruiser, and that's when you have your diff that's located in the center and CV joints that have A-arms that allow the front suspension to adjust or suspend independently. So when lifting out the back of the cruiser, like I mentioned earlier, I did experience a lift of 4 inches. Now, this significantly affected the geometry of this rear axle, and what it is, it pushed the axle across through the vehicle. So as the vehicle lifts up, the axle will shift a little bit. So the axle did shift across the driver's side of the vehicle, and when fitted these larger tires with a 25mm offset, bringing them right out to the guards, it was very obvious that the driver's side was actually poking out about 10mm, and this side here, the passenger here, was actually sunk into the vehicle. Now, if you are keeping the standard rims or potentially standard tyres as well, you might not notice this difference, but if you are fitting these 25mm offset or a larger offset wheel, it could potentially become quite obvious. So fitting a Panhard rod that is fully adjustable means that Panhard rod can be adjusted to suit the new suspension lift, which means that we can adjust it to bring that axle back in alignment with the body of the vehicle. Now, if you do this, again, it's going to affect the geometry of the vehicle, and you will need to get a wheel alignment to make sure everything's lined up properly and you don't wear the tires down prematurely. But not only is it going to make sure your car is legal by keeping those wheels within the guards, but it's also going to make sure your car looks good when you're traveling on the highway, making sure it doesn't look like it's crabbing a little bit going down the highway. Now, one question I have had in relation to the Panhard rod is what happens when you load up the car and the suspension does compress a little, the wheels and tires not move a little bit. Well, of course, the axle is going to shift a tiny bit, but given the fact that you do have those 400 kilo constant springs with the airbag helpers, the shift in that axle is negligible. Obviously, if you have a standard cruiser with a standard Panhard rod and standard suspension, you're going to have the same sort of motion as well. And if you load up your car, the odds of you noticing that axle move across is very unlikely. It's exactly the same with having an aftermarket Panhard rod and aftermarket suspension. Although I load it up, the shift is so negligible, you're not going to notice any sort of shift in that axle. So there you have it, guys. That is the suspension setup I'm running in the rear of the Landcruiser. So I hope it answers some of the questions that some may have in regards to how I set the vehicle up and how it handles and how it performs when both laden and unladen around town. Now the big question is, would I do anything again if I had to build this car from scratch? I'm happy with all the components that have been fitted to the car. Nothing has caused an issue in this vehicle. ARB have made quality products that have lasted. This is the third car with ARB suspension installed. Now I did unfortunately miss out on that 4-ton GVM upgrade. However, fortunately I'm yet to load my car up more than 3.845 ton anyway, which is currently rated at. However, if it's an option that comes with this suspension kit anyway, then that's just a bonus. Keeping in mind, you've got to monitor your GCMs. You can bind mass with your trailer on as well if you are going to load your vehicle up to those sorts of weights. Now, although I have fitted ARB to the last few cars, keep in mind they are not the only suspension manufacturers out there, and for the Cruiser there are many different options for all types of vehicles. ARB is one that I have just found reliable and stood the test of time so far. And I know that if anything does go wrong, there are plenty of dealerships around the country that I can take my components into, and most manufacturers or mechanics are familiar with their setups. So make sure you do the research for your vehicle to decide which one is right for you. However, if you are planning on touring and traveling Australia, whether it be with a caravan or not, even a camper trailer, make sure you get your suspension set up correctly for your application. It really does alter the effect and the handling of your vehicle, and does provide a safe, a comfortable ride for you and your family when you're out about on the tracks and the highway. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have any questions or queries or want me to explain anything further that I've spoken about today, make sure to hit us up on Facebook or Exploring Oz. I am more than happy to answer any of your questions to make sure you guys get the right setup for your ultimate touring vehicle. Otherwise guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.